Karanga mai, mihi mai rā. Ko te wehi kia iho wa kororihea ki tōna ingoa tāpū. I nā mate huhua e tangi tonu nei te maka. Haere, haere, oki oki rā. Whakaheia e nei uri e kawea nei i tēnei kaupapa. Nā ringa ringa nā wai wai o te paki pūmeka nei e. Pōhiritia mai, karanga mai nei.
Te ikanatu ko te kaua nui, ko te kaua rō, ko te kaua tiki tiki, ko te kaua tuatahi, ko te kaua tua ngāhuru, ko te kaua tapu, ke o matua nui, kia mau ki te tika, kia mau ki te pono, kia mau ki te aroha, ki te whaiao, ki te ao mārama, tihei mauri ora. Ko putu ake te maunga, ko rangatai ki te awa, ko Ngāti awa te iwi, ko mātātua te waka, ko Jim Meita tōku ingoa. Ko hau te he mana o te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. E kui mā, e koro mā, e raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. My name is Jim Meita. It's a huge honour for me as the Chairman of RNZ to welcome you all to this premiere of Stolen Lands. I want to firstly acknowledge through my pepeha the relationship between my iwi of Ngāti Awa and Te Whakatōhea, and also the fact that there is a strong understanding of the hurt and pain and subsequent celebration of the life of our tupuna Mokomoko. I need to also acknowledge Jake and Claire for the amazing work through 10 Canaries that they have done to produce this Paki Pūmeka. RNZ has been strongly supportive of this initiative because we believe it's important that we tell our stories in an authentic and genuine way, which is just what Jake, Claire and all of the 10 Canaries team have done. We are very proud to be associated with this important part of our history as a nation, and we look forward to you also having the opportunity to view this very important Paki Pūmeka. Nō reira, e raurangatira mā, e kui mā, e koro mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa.
Tēnā koutou. I'm Jake Mokomoko, the director of this documentary. As a descendant of Mokomoko, I am honoured to bring his story to life. Without the support of our whānau and family members, none of this would have been possible. To our team, 10 Canaries, Tactics Films, our amazing talent, our production team and all operators involved in this cinematic masterpiece, we thank you. To our producer, Claire Varley, who stood strong in the vision, I thank you. Without you, none of this would have been possible. To our commissioners and industry supporters, Te Māngai Pāho, Radio New Zealand, Te Papa, we sincerely thank you for your support and belief in this kaupapa. This production took us from the East Cape of Tiki Tiki to the brick and mortar of Mount Eden Prison as our story winds along the Waikato River, down past Taranaki Maunga, back to where it all started, Opotiki. We send a big thank you to the communities and individuals that contributed along the way. In this documentary, we discover the key events that shaped Mokomoko's fate. We uncover the fascinating people who played a pivotal role in his journey. from the bountiful lands of Opotiki to the shackles of Mount Eden prison. Whether you consider yourself a Kiwi, New Zealander, Māori, or simply someone who loves a great story, as a nation, this is our story, a part of who we are, and our aim is to proudly share our history and culture with the world. To many, his story is unknown, so I urge you, engage as we wind back the hands of time, experience our rich heritage as you learn the incredible story of Mokomoko. What you're about to see next is just a taste, so be sure to follow Radio New Zealand and our online platforms. I am Jake Mokomoko, and I welcome you to Stolen Lands. The 1860s was a trying time for Māori in Aotearoa. Wars were raging between the Crown and Māori in Taranaki. The clash between religions brought about division.
This was a really difficult situation for anyone to make sense of.
The treaty gave Māori the right to a fair trial.
The decision was made that Volkner was to die.
We only read about these things in books and papers and stories. But to actually see them happening, it was unbelievable.
O tēnei whenua, I heke mai a nuku tere waka. O te upoko rangatira o nuku tere waka, o te pironui. Pakaihu tia mai te waka, ki te kūrai ki tarakea, ka ū atu ki te kōtukutuku. I reira ka tuku atu, a tau tūrangi I reira. Ka noho tonu te upoko te rangatira o te waka, ki rongi te waka, a te pironui. A hoatu e te pironui, ko te kaitiaki o te waka, ko Te Māngai Pāho. E kōhatu I me tia ki te karakia, I Hawaii ki nui, Hawaii ki roa, Hawaii ki pāmamao. Te Māngai Pāho, ko te atua tērā, I Hawaii ki nui. Whakatōhea ki roti te kōhatu, ngā karakia. Ia tai pai mai te waka, ki tēnei whenua. Ka hoatu e te pironui, te kōhatu. I te honga I noho aka I opape, I te kōtukutuku.
Mokomoko came from a line of many chiefs. He had very noble bloodlines, descending from Muriwai, Kurawhirangi rangi kurukuru, Te Hauo Te Rangi e Roamoko. Some of the chiefly bloodlines to note.
A chief in his time, a rangatira, he had a certain posting in terms of the boundaries of Te Whakatōhea, and that's where his lands were. The clear evidence is that he had the mana in those lands.
Whakatōhea have occupied the coastal lands and rich alluvial plains around Opotiki since the arrival of their tipuna.
He became the protector of the western boundary for Te Whakatōhea, and it was his job to sustain the western boundary at Marae Tōtara for Te Whakatōhea.
Governor Grey is one of the most controversial figures in the whole of New Zealand history. For many, many years held up as a hero in the very British curriculum or English curriculum in New Zealand schools, increasingly regarded as a very ambiguous and doubtful figure. He'd first served as Governor of New Zealand in 1845 to 1853.
1863 is a crisis year. It's a year when Grey will launch the invasion of the Waikato. It's a year when there are further warfare breaking out in Taranaki. And General Cameron will begin the long campaign to take the Waikato, going up the river. So when Grey arrives, the war in Taranaki is sort of petering on. It hasn't been successfully resolved. But Grey is primarily concerned with the kingitanga, which he sees as the big threat.
The more we can see that Grey, who appeared to have great appeal to Māori, he acted with it. He knew how to play up to Māori leaders. He knew how to, give them a sense of importance and dignity. But at the same time, we now know from his correspondence and from his actions that he was often acting behind the back of the Colonial Office, certainly acting behind the back of what he'd said to Māori, very attentive to settler opinion. And remember, the settlers now had their own parliament.
He will implement the confiscation policy, but I think he knows that this policy is going to create long-term problems because of his understanding of the Māori world. His ministers, particularly those in Auckland, see this as a massive land grab.
Volkner may not have realised how much he was fully a client of the tribe. He was truly dependent upon the support of the tribe, and so Volkner, who perhaps didn't have his cues as tightly linked into reality as some of the older missionaries who had learnt by brutal reality that they needed to keep on side with the tribe.
Seeing missionaries as being agents of the government and agents of colonisation and trying to stop that. Those who remain loyal to the governor will see that as a threat to their own tribes and their own way of thinking. So this is a kind of conflict that comes into this area with Kariopa and a band of about 30, 40, not a big number, who arrive here. Volkner, of course, is quite clearly identified as somebody who is siding with the Crown.
But by the end of that long event, the decision was made that Volkner and Volkner alone was to die.
Killing of a missionary is a big deal. To kill a missionary was to cross over a boundary that Europeans considered very dramatic. To kill a missionary was far more horrifying than to kill women and children in this period. So something has to be done about it. Now what's interesting is how they get to identify Mokomoko as being one of those involved. There's a Portuguese trader who is hanging around the area, and in middle of 1865, in July, he wrote a letter that gets to Governor Grey that fingers Mokomoko as one of those involved in the killing. So by the time they're going into Whakatōhea at the end of the year, they have a kind of hit list in their minds. Because he was accused of holding the rope, then that, of course, makes him an active participant in the actual event. If he provided the rope deliberately and that was handed over. So that, in a sense, I think was quite an important part of the evidence against him. And yet that evidence of the rope was contradicted by other witnesses, and certainly contradicted by Mokomoko himself. So I think that rope is the kind of problem for him, even though that evidence is very, very, very dodgy. This was a really difficult situation for anyone to make sense of. It was an event that occurred with very few, if any, Māori witnesses, but it was also an event where most of those people who were really heavily behind it had disappeared. You know, they were in what the court would say, in the bush.
Mokomoko himself did not give evidence, and whilst it's not a requirement that he does give evidence, and I understand at the time there was a common practice that lawyers didn't put the accused in the dock to give evidence. But of course, Mokomoko had no chance to respond to the allegations. And I believe none of the other defendants gave evidence as well.
He was seen as one of the few rangatira left that I think the Crown saw that would be a barrier to their gaining further land in the Eastern Bay of Plenty.
Firstly, and naturally, if you grow up knowing that your tupuna was allegedly hung someone and was subsequently hung himself, that must have an impact, regardless of guilt or otherwise, particularly in the Māori world.
The 19th of October, just before midnight, we assembled outside Mount Eden prison. And when we arrived where the headstones, where the markers were, we formed a circle. E tohu tērā. Even the birds understand the wairua. Over the years, it keeps coming to the surface. Just the wairua of the story itself keeps bubbling within me. People, eyebrows raised when they hear that I was involved with the mokomoko, and people wanting to know what actually happened. And every time I share that story, the wairua comes back to the surface.
I guess you've got to look at what happened back then through a lens of how the colonial government, settlers, viewed Māori as a race. There were different values at play, different practices and protocols that were underpinned by those differing values. And when those collided, invariably, as time went on post-1840, the Eurocentric values and principles started to dominate. Add into the mix the desire for Māori land and resources to grow the colony, created, I think, a concoction where, and it's seen across the world when the British have colonised various countries, of a mindset that they're not quite on par. And that must influence the way in which, when you're looking for fairness in terms of justice, how people view that. There must be a nexus between what occurred then and the erosion of Māori values, the physical erosion of land, the spiritual erosion of language, and the criminal justice statistics that we experience today. There must be a nexus between that. And I said earlier, this sort of notion of tangata whenua or mana whenua, you know, kua ngaro te whenua, what have you got left? Tangata. And if your whole mindset is about that connection to the land, to the river, to the mountains, and that has been taken away over time, that must have some effect.
te reo, te take.